The road took us through Patras and Corinth to Athens. It was intended that in Athens we should take part in a parade commanded by Field Marshal List. After so many impressions, we crossed the Corinth Canal, which cut deeply into the isthmus, and that same evening stood at the Acropolis. Many of my companions, who had never before known anything about classical antiquity, were amazed at its technical and cultural achievements made 2,500 years ago. The lovers of classicism among us were inspired, and probably for the first time, it was in the Acropolis and the Propylaea that they were able to truly engage with classical ancient culture. For them, a visit to ancient Hellas was like a return to the youth of our civilization. The ancient Hellas, which around 1500 BC gave rise to the closely related Germans, Slavs and Balts, remained virtually in place. This is what Maya alludes to in order to show how deeply the foundations on which the millennial Reich was built were laid. We saw places we had never seen before, but it was here that we, enveloped in mystical power, drew new strength from the Hellenic heritage and were ready to step forward, making sacrifices for the homeland. A Greek soldier stood guard at the monument to the unknown soldier. Here, the brave soldiers who sacrificed everything for their country were memorialized. We moved through Thermopylae, Larissa and the Kledi Pass, past burned tanks and armored vehicles and freshly sprinkled gravesites, through Monastir, Belgrade and Vienna to the area east of Prague. Here we regained our sense of reality and got down to tidying up our weapons and military equipment. We had no idea what awaited us. The troops were in a feverish excitement. New military equipment and more advanced weaponry had arrived. The experience of the Balkan campaign was analyzed and intensive training began again. Everything we did was subordinated to speed of execution. Experience had taught us that only the one who acts faster wins the victory, and in battle only the most nimble soldier survives. The camaraderie in my battalion was like that of a large family. Iron discipline was the backbone of this community. We approached each successive exercise imbued with these core values and forged an instrument on which I could play all the symphonies of combat. Company commanders and platoon leaders mastered the art of playing these keys, and my young comrades became soldiers who I could command without particularly keeping in check, and they understood me half-heartedly. My soldiers were not ignorant chumps held together by a Slavic zombie-like obedience. No, in front of me stood young individuals who believed in themselves, in their own values and in their own strength. War with the Soviet Union. The news of the attack on the Soviet Union struck us like a lightning strike. While in the Czech Republic, we listened on the radio as Adolf Hitler justified his decision with the desire to finally destroy Bolshevism, which threatened the whole world, with the misgiving that we might suffer the same dashing fate as our fathers, who had fallen victim to war on several fronts in 1914-1918, we prepared ourselves for the most brutal war in which soldiers have ever had to participate. On the morning of June 27, 1941, our battalion marched eastward past cheering citizens through Olomouc in Moravia, Raciborz and Bytom in Silesia. On June 30, we crossed the Vistula River near Anopolis, and at Out Zero reached the Russian border near the locality of Ustiliog. Meanwhile, our forces had already advanced far to the east. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, which had been transformed from a brigade into a division, was attached to Army Group South. Its immediate task was a breakthrough by motorized units in the direction of Kiev, during which the Russian forces west of the Dnieper should be destroyed. To accomplish this task, Army Group had 26 infantry divisions, 4 motorized infantry divisions, 4 Jaeger divisions and 5 tank divisions at its disposal. Supported the offensive Army Group South 4th Air Fleet under the command of Colonel General Leah. Field Marshal von Rundstedt was opposed by Marshal Budeny with 40 infantry divisions, 14 motorized divisions, 6 mechanized corps and 21 cavalry divisions. The Russians fought hard and steadfastly for every inch of land. Fierce fighting was going on all along the front when we reached the highway north near Lutsk on July 1. On July 2, we received orders to move to Rivne through Kleven and establish contact with the II motorized corps there. We received a report that the II motorized corps was surrounded near Rivne. Large mechanized formations of the enemy attacked our stretched flanks. The situation with the enemy was something completely new to us. Slightly discouraged, I looked at my maps to inform my soldiers of the situation. The previous criteria were no longer applicable. Where was the clear demarcation between us and the enemy? Far ahead. The tank divisions of the ITI motorized corps deployed fighting east of Rovno. German infantry units were fighting a few kilometers ahead of us, and Russian troops were fighting north and south of us. After unsuccessfully trying to give my comrades a clear picture of the positions, I summarized the situation with the following words. As of today, the enemy is everywhere. I had not yet realized, as I addressed my soldiers, how close to the truth I was in summarizing the situation. A couple of kilometers east of Lutsk, near the railroad, we came upon the last outposts of an infantry battalion. Clouds of thick smoke showed us the location of a Russian tank that had been hit. Dark forest stretched on both sides of the road on which we were traveling in an easterly direction. We had to cover a distance of 60 kilometers to reach Rovno. Would we reach our objective on time and be able to provide our comrades from the 25th Infantry Division with tangible support? I signaled the forward units to start moving into the looming night. In the lead was Fritz Montag. Montag was a World War I veteran and commander of the motorcycle platoon of 1st Company, 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion. Slowly at first, then faster and faster. The vanguard moved forward into the dark woods. I wanted to shout, "Stop! What I've been telling you is not true. The car is not your friend. Move slowly, or you will come to your death." But my lips remained compressed. They were compressed in a way that left no gap for airflow. Squinting my eyes, I followed the advanced units of the column with my gaze, moving further and further into the forest. On the sides of the road were Russian tanks that had been hit. Trucks and gooseneck vehicles were abandoned under the trees. In one place we found 12 camouflaged Russian T-226 light tanks. They had no fuel in them and were also abandoned. Ready for battle, the battalion was moving through a vast wasteland stretching northward. Suddenly I saw the advance platoon disappear and our armoured vehicle's 20 cannon opened fire on individual bushes. Then 4 or 5 of these bushes moved towards us and started firing from a distance of about 150 meters. Well-camouflaged Russian tanks attacked the marching column. In a flash everyone hid in the bushes and watched the duel between our armoured vehicles and the enemy tanks. A few of our anti-tank guns engaged and put an end to the confusion. A few minutes later we resumed the march. The burning tanks still lit up the night sky behind us for a long time. So at 10:30 p.m. we exchanged our first shots with the Soviets. In order to be sure that we would fulfill the task, I sent a combat reconnaissance group in the southern direction and told to go to Klevani through Olaika and wait for the battalion in Klevani. When we reached Stovek and moved further east, we were already enveloped in total darkness. Shortly after midnight, I recognized a truck crossing the road directly in front of me, and then other vehicles on the narrow forest road. Russians. Within minutes, the motorcyclists opened machine gun fire in their direction. Several enemy trucks erupted like torches, and tall sheaves of fire illuminated the intersection of forest roads. The forest had an unearthly effect. The darkness was overwhelming and extremely tense. I was uneasy. Such a battle was too unpredictable for me, and, among other things, I had not had the necessary experience of war with the Russians. Hour after hour, we moved in the dark. More than 30 kilometers still separated us from Rovno. A couple of kilometers from Klevani, just behind a forest, which, thank God, we had passed, we stopped, and the battalion closed ranks. We could hear the sound of fierce fighting coming from the direction of Klevani. The flashes of fire rising upwards showed us where the battle was. When I was about to move on Kleven, a terrible scream sounded behind me. Among the explosions of grenades, swearing soldiers, the scraping of tank tracks and the rumble of breaking metal, I could distinguish the outline of a tank in the column. To my horror, I saw that the tank was going straight through the motorcycles. Then it took a sharp left turn across the road and disappeared into the darkness. Hardly had we recovered from this surprise when the same trick was repeated a little farther back, at the end of the column. 2 enemy tanks drove into our marching column in the dark and only noticed their mistake when they stopped. We, for our part, mistook them for our own armoured vehicles and thus moved along the forest road in company with the Russians. Other Russian tanks were spotted to the left of the road. The combat reconnaissance group I had sent to Orlyka had contacted part of the 3rd Battalion, 1st S Infantry Regiment, and was under heavy pressure from the large Russian force. The 12th Company of the 1st S Infantry Regiment requested assistance because the Russians had surrounded it. So, as soon as dawn broke, we had to rescue the threatened units and continue the offensive in the direction of Rovno. We quickly rushed forward. The Russians were fighting for the road. In the meantime, it became quite light, and we could distinguish a long column of abandoned trucks. The enemy infantry was directly in front of us in fields of tall wheat and was trying to overpower the 12th Company of the 1st SS Infantry Regiment. So far, the enemy's attempts had been unsuccessful. The SS Company received reinforcements just in time in the form of our armoured car. Wasting no time, we returned through the forest to Klevan. The village was taken, and the offensive on Rovno continued. The road went in a southeastern direction. In a couple of kilometres from Klevan, the road went down, then again steeply uphill. I was moving behind a platoon of advance guard and was looking at the terrain with my binoculars. Suddenly I thought I saw an abandoned cannon on the slope. Among the green grass field, I made out a couple of light patches. The gun was a light field gun of 75 BEM caliber that had been left in a firing position. It made a depressing impression on us. This was the first time we had found a German gun abandoned on a battlefield. A few steps away from the gun stood a gutted ambulance. Its doors were open and covered with blood. Silently we surveyed the devastated area. No soldiers were found alive or dead. We moved slowly up the rise of the road. The prominent light patches became more and more clearly visible. We could distinguish the large and small patches very clearly. I let go of the binoculars, wiped my eyes, and picked up the binoculars again. My God, was this really possible? Could what I had just seen be real? We covered the last couple of 100 meters quickly. The advance guard platoon dismounted and ran with me toward the light areas. Our steps slowed. We froze. We didn't dare to go any further. Steel helmets were held in our hands as if we were at prayer. Not a single word defiled this place. Even the birds were silent. Before us lay the naked bodies of a ruthlessly mangled company of German soldiers. Their hands were bound with wire. Wide-open eyes stared at us. The officers of this company had found an even more brutal death. They were lying a few meters away from their comrades. We found their bodies torn to pieces and trampled by their feet. Still not a word was spoken. Here it was Her Majesty Death that spoke. Slowly we walked past our slain comrades. My soldiers stood facing me. They expected me to give them an explanation or guidance on how to behave in Russia in the future. We looked at each other. I gazed into each soldier's eyes. Without a word, I turned and we moved toward the unknown. Up to July 7, we again and again repelled Russian attacks north of Rovno. The enemy suffered heavy losses. Our losses were minimal. At 14.0, we received an order to cover the flank of the 11th Panzer Division and to reconnoitre to the northeast of Miropol. At noon the next day, we fought with large enemy forces in the forest area north of the village of Dzerzhinsk. The enemy artillery was firing harassing fire. From data received by reconnaissance units and from defectors, we recognized a motorized battalion with several tanks and batteries. Toward evening, we lost a 20 anti-aircraft gun as a result of a direct hit by a Russian shell. The wounded gun crew was evacuated. Meanwhile, on the highway north, the situation became critical. The tank divisions of the IE Motorized Corps were moving further forward in the direction of Zhytomyr and Kiev, and the 25th Infantry Motorized Division, which was to provide cover for the extended flank of the corps, was attacked from the north by large enemy forces. The threat loomed over the North Highway, the Corps' vital artery. Therefore, on July 9, we received orders to attack the enemy north of Dzerzhinsk, advance through wooded areas to the north and establish contact with the 25th Motorcycle Battalion near Sokolov. After a massive artillery preparation, I wanted to conduct an attack by motorized units in order to immediately cut into the depth of the Russian defences and realize the advantage of the surprise factor. The 1st Motorcycle Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion took the position for the attack behind a small rise. Fritz Montag again went to the forward patrol. The company commander, my old and faithful comrade Gerd Bremer, once again repeated the battle order and went to his vehicle. I forbade the company to engage the enemy or reduce speed before it reached the edge of the forest. The intention was to rush at full speed through the enemy's lines of battle and leave the rest to the next battalion to do. 2 88 MIM anti-aircraft guns were mounted on each side of the road. They were tasked to open fire as soon as the company went on the attack, providing fire support. The anti-aircraft guns would clear the way for the attacking company. Exactly at 17:30 our guns began to talk, crushing the forest on both sides of the road. Motorcycle engines roared. Motorcycles with sidecars and the soldiers sitting on them were like predators, singing to their BMWDs. My comrades tore down the rise and raced toward the bursts of shells and the clatter of enemy machine guns. Within seconds, the company reached the edge of the forest and disappeared from view. My driver Peter pressed the accelerator pedal, and we rushed after the company. Our artillery was still firing at the edge of the forest. Not a shot was fired back at us, however. The little dirty horses were chewing their bridles. The Russians fled northward on both sides of the road. But what happened then? The company halted. It opened fire on the fleeing Russians and isolated pockets of resistance. The company began to advance on foot and was losing precious time. This cannot be allowed. We had to reach a crossroads a few kilometers further north and prevent an organized Russian withdrawal from the forest to the left edge of our offensive front. Angry, I moved forward to resume the advance. Armored vehicles and assault guns were clearing the way for the motorcyclists. Within minutes we had captured Russian guns, tractors and trucks. One thing we could not do was to stop. We had to keep moving and take advantage of the enemy's confusion. The exhausted, unarmed Russians approached us shouting something. At first I didn't understand what they were shouting, but then I heard. Ukrainian, Ukrainian. They were rejoicing like children and hugging each other wordlessly. The war was over for them. We reached the crossroads at 6:15 p.m. We outpaced the Red Army columns retreating eastward and disarmed them. The Russians were now resisting only sporadically. They had completely lost their presence of mind from the battalion's lightning advance. Hundreds of prisoners were collected on the road. Many small arms and other weapons were captured. The enemy was in a situation that was to our advantage. Their units had just begun their withdrawal. Unfortunately, we lost a light armoured vehicle that was hit by anti-tank gunfire during the battle. But thank God, we could only complain that, during the entire operation, only one of our comrades was wounded. Although we had adapted to the Russian manner of fighting and felt our complete superiority, I thought it prudent to withdraw and spend the night in the liberated area in the woods. The main forces of our division were still fighting somewhere and could catch up with us only by morning. The forest was alive. We heard the Russian columns retreating in the eastern direction. These were the last units withdrawing from the Stalin line of the state border with Poland. They were looking for a way eastward between the advancing German troops, through forests, swamps, and places relatively hidden to observation. We lay down with battle-ready weapons under our arm and awaited the new morning. The rustling of the branches of the tall trees mingled with the distant rattle of the shots of a few of our guns somewhere to the east. The morning sun was truly bountiful, and the Lord had given us a marvelous summer day. I reluctantly gave the order to move north. The 1st Company, 1st CC Reconnaissance Battalion, had again gone forward and was waiting on the road ready to move when I told Bremer to brake for the freeway. Overtaking my armoured car, The soldiers waved, smiling at me and finishing the remains of their breakfast. Would a new day bring something? I quickly and briefly briefed the commander of the 2nd Company, 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion, Krayas, and followed the company of the Combat Marching Guard. For about 5 minutes I followed ahead. In addition to my command vehicle, I was accompanied by 2 messengers on motorcycles, Heinz Drischer, my brilliant interpreter, and I sat on the armoured car as we overcame a small rise and were able to scout the route for several kilometres. From afar we could see the last motorcyclists disappearing around the corner. The main force of the battalion would follow us in a few minutes. They were waiting for the artillery to join the column. We silently looked ahead and enjoyed the beautiful sunny day. It is amazing how in the course of a combat operation one quickly forgets the bloody battles and considers even a few minutes of peace a gift from God. The deep silence was broken by an event that was perhaps the most interesting of all that had happened to me during the years of front life. To my great surprise, I saw a Russian anti-tank gun in a firing position already passing by it. Behind the shield of the cannon I could see the tense faces of several Russian soldiers. I wanted to shout, but I suppressed the shout and let my armoured car drive forward another 200 meters before I stopped it. The messengers on motorcycles were briefed about the cannon, and I headed with 2 officers and 4 soldiers into the woods to neutralize the forgotten anti-tank gun from the rear. Like redskins on the warpath, we picked our way through tall thickets of heather and blueberries from tree to tree. I could see the gun through the trees. The gun crew was no longer visible. Could it be that the Russian artillerymen had fled? Had they abandoned their gun? I clutched tightly in my hands, keeping my finger on the trigger, my Mr. 38 automatic rifle. My eyes were still fixed on the artillery position. I could hear Drescher's breathing behind me and did not dare to turn around. Step by step, we were approaching the cannon. "Stop! Stop! Hands up!" The Russians looked at me, grimacing amusingly. I stood surrounded by a Russian company. All the while, my comrades and I were sneaking in the passage between 2 Russian platoons. My blood froze in my veins. Lone rifles were pointed at us. Stunned, I looked at the people surrounding me. Force was no longer the answer. In a muffled voice, I commanded my comrades, "Hold your fire." The guns came down. An athletic, handsome officer stood 10 meters away from me. I went to him. He, too, separated from his comrades and headed towards me. It became quiet. The Russian soldiers and my comrades were watching this encounter. We stopped 2 meters away from each other. Each took a weapon in his left hand and almost simultaneously saluted the enemy. Then we took the last step and shook hands. All this time I felt no emotion. I felt neither beaten nor victorious. When we straightened up after a slight bend, we each declared the other our prisoner. The Russian laughed as if I had given out the best joke of the year. His big blue eyes sparkled, looking at me while I slipped my hand into my pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes for him. He waited politely while I pressed the cigarette between my lips, then lit the fire with a match. We both acted as if we were alone on a wide plain, and as if the war had long since been forgotten. The Russian spoke only broken German, and I spoke no Russian. I beckoned to Drescher and managed to whisper to him, "We need to buy time." Drescher and the Russian went into a long negotiation about whose side should lay down their arms. While all this was going on, I went from one Russian to another and offered cigarettes. With a grin, the young Russian soldiers took the cigarettes and sniffed before inserting the end of the cigarette between their lips. They enjoyed the flavor of the cigarettes. I gave each Russian a friendly pat on the shoulder, indicating that they should put their weapons on the ground. But in the blink of an eye, the pack was empty. Only then did I realize that I had somewhat removed myself from Drescher and was standing alone among the Russians. I was unspeakably glad as soon as I rejoined my group of my own around Drescher. From the officer's intonation, I realized that his patience would soon come to an end. Very slowly, I moved closer to the edge of the woods to force Drescher and the Russian to continue their negotiations outside the woods. I waited for the approach of the battalion. It could show up at any moment and end this nightmare. All three of us stood at the edge of the forest and tried once again to explain to the Russian that his unit was surrounded and that the vanguard of our first tank group had almost reached Kiev. Then the Russian shook his head vigorously and told Drescher to tell me that he was an officer, not a dumbass. At that moment there was an explosion on the road and I saw a light armoured vehicle engulfed in flames. A Russian anti-tank gun had hit it from a distance of about 20 meters. Clouds of thick smoke were rising into the sky. Since I knew that all my vehicles always moved rather spread out to have a sufficient firing sector, the next vehicle could appear at any moment. Its turret would appear from behind the climb at any second. The Russian insisted that I put my automatic rifle on the ground. I asked Drescher to explain to the Russian officer that I did not understand the last sentence and that he should show me what he meant. The Russian looked at me incredulously and put his fine automatic rifle with telescopic sight on the road. He shouldn't have done that. With lightning speed, I was near the weapon, stepped on it, and stood, pressing my shoulder against my opponent's shoulder. And we both stood like statues between the Russians on one side of the road and my comrades on the other. All my soldiers had moved to our side of the road. From deep in the woods, the commissar's voice fanatically called for action. More and more Russian rifles were pointed at me, and I even pressed myself even more closely against the officer. Even Drescher hid in the ditch. At that moment a shadow ran past me. I did not dare to look back, but nevertheless I realized that it was my armoured vehicles. Everything happened lightning fast. The commissar's commands left no doubt that fire could be opened at any moment. I took one last look into the eyes of my opponent. He sensed what was coming. Calmly he looked back. Then I shouted. The explosions of fragmentation shells from the 20mm automatic guns of the armoured vehicles shook the forest. My comrades threw grenades across the road, and I instantly jumped into the ditch. The Russian commander was lying on the road. The war was over for him. We tried to retreat, but it was impossible. There was a small bridge ahead. The armoured car had a couple of 100 meters to go forward when a Russian anti-tank gun transferred its fire there. It was getting uncomfortable. We expected the Russians to attack across the road at any moment. At that moment something happened that I will never forget. Our youngest motorcycle messenger, Heinz Sklund, jumped up, ran to his sidecar motorcycle, jumped on the seat and disappeared. I saw him ride to the armoured car, shouted something to its commander, and then came back to us. He waved to me. I jumped up and lowered myself across between the seat and the baby carriage, and we rushed back to our battalion. The second company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion was rushing in, and Hugo Craez was leading the attack. Heavy guns, mortars, and infantrymen with small arms quickly took up positions. The fighting was heavy. The Russians fought behind every tree. But it was to no avail. In 15 minutes it was over. I looked for the Russian commander and found him with his chest pierced by bullets. He was buried in the same grave as my comrades who had fallen in this battle. After the battle at Marshilivsk, we reached the highway north, along which were moving parts of the 25th Infantry Motorized Division and support units of the 13th and 14th Panzer Divisions. Among the Russians killed at Marshilivsk was Commissar Numa. We were curious if he was German. The 25th Motorcycle Battalion had engaged in a fierce battle north of Sokolov and requested our assistance. I placed a couple of assault guns at their disposal, which soon provided support for the battalion. Our battalion as a covering force occupied an area east of Sokolov, about 20 kilometers along the front. At about 2:55 p.m. traffic on the highway was interrupted. The enemy forces crossed it west of Sokolov and thus cut off all supply routes of the II Motorized Corps. The section of our battalion was subjected to hurricane fire. Our headquarters was stationed under a lovely oak tree 100 meters south of the highway. Machine gun fire pierced the thick foliage of the tree so that the green leaves swirled and fell to the ground. Peter got me a plate of rice pudding, which I ate with great gusto under the protection of the thick trunk. Only now, many hours after the incident with the Russian commander, did I find time to think about food. Suddenly the rice became tasteless and goosebumps ran all over my body. At dawn, the headquarters was within range of the heavy artillery. Companies were reporting enemy concentrations in the wooded areas north of the freeway. We were using artillery and other heavy weapons to try to eliminate the detected enemy concentrations. But the Russians were not going to lose their presence of mind. I was worried about my motorcyclists, as the section was unusually large and there were no reserves on hand. The company's armoured vehicles were snorting back and forth along the highway to cover gaps in our defence. It looked like it was going to be a hot night. I drove again to the right flank of the sector to visit the two motorised companies. The first company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion, with its right flank on the Tenia Bridge, was under particularly brutal attack. Both companies were well entrenched. My motorcyclists burrowed into the ground for the first time in this war. All along the stretch, my armoured vehicle was under machine gun and small arms fire. Russian bullets clattered on the armour and ricocheted, making a singing sound that filled the whole place. The battalion personnel entrenched themselves, and everyone from cooks to clerks to the last driver were in firing positions waiting for nightfall. At 11:30 p.m., the expected Russian attack began. A terrible hail of metal rained down on our section. The hideous cries of "Ure Muar Ra" made the blood run cold in our veins. These unnerving screams were something new to us. Flashes illuminated the darkness. Tracer bullets created a path of colour in the night. The Russians broke through to the highway, and the attack was only smothered by the flanking fire of several armoured cars. Another attack followed around midnight. Its main effort was directed at the 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion. The Russians broke through its positions and destroyed 2 machine gun nests, but were repulsed with sapper blades and bayonets in the melee. The former positions were repulsed. The enemy artillery fire became more intense for the first time. A battery of heavy rail guns fired intense fire on the crossroads south of Sokolov and the battalion headquarters east of the crossroads. The motorcycle companies were running out of ammunition and the motorcyclists were asking for urgent resupply. But how could we get ammunition to the right flank? There were no avenues of approach to the right flank, and the highway was the dividing line between the Russians and us. Only the highway separated the fighting units of the enemy from each other. I heard Krause's voice again on my headphones and saw the terrible fireworks on his section to my right. The 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion and the mortars needed ammunition back. Shouts of hurrah, hurrah, were heard on my right. It was the Russians attacking our headquarters. A platoon of 20 MEM anti-aircraft guns opened fire on the attackers. They were firing anti-aircraft shells that gave a lot of shrapnel when they burst. The anti-aircraft guns concentrated their fire primarily on the bushes at the far end of the road. Then Peter removed the camouflage covering from his left headlight and drove off, lighting his way down the road. The armoured vehicle was hit by bullets several times during the drive, but ammunition was delivered to the companies. In vain I asked for reinforcements. The arrival of the other battalions could be expected at the earliest by noon. They were still just removing from the fortified line near Miropol. Again, the enemy's heavy artillery fire rained down on the right flank of the section. Shells from Russian 152mm guns, mounted on railroad platforms, shook the woods on the section of the 1st Company. 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion, and at about 0 a third avalanche of Russians rained down on us. A few minutes later, the flanking company requested reinforcements. The enemy cut into its defensive positions, and hand-to-hand fighting ensued. Crazy creatures, Russians and Germans, fighting for their lives. Every man for himself. I couldn't take it anymore. I ripped off the headphones, jumped into the armoured car and drove. Looking neither left nor right, my driver drove straight through groups of attacking Russians who were crossing the highway where there were gaps in our defences. We were moving without turning on our headlights, so we could only see the shadows of those crossing the road. The brakes squealed as the car made a left turn in the road and then disappeared behind a small rural building. The motorcyclists were just fending off the last Russian attack. It was completely smothered, having been repulsed by the defenders. The attackers were completely annihilated. The screams of the men, mixed with the clatter of machine guns and the deafening explosions of grenades, made all communication impossible. Creyas and I crawled behind the rubble of the wall, probably 20 meters south of the road, and tried to make out something in the morning fog. Russian heavy mortar fire covered the whole area. Several motorcyclists carried a badly wounded comrade out of the battle and then tore his gymnospear on him to give him first aid. I looked out and saw my old comrade Gretzik. His eyes were closed and his chest was weakly rising and falling. He was mortally wounded. I called his name. I wanted to bring him back to life, but it was in vain. Death was already taking its course. His lips moved, as if Gretzik wanted me to convey his last farewell words to his wife and children. His eyelids lifted so that his eyes, which no longer saw anything, became visible. Then his head slowly fell to the side. A bullet in the heart cut short his life. Besses Hauptscharführer von Berg, a veteran field failed, but of first the 14th and then the 15th Company of the 1st SS Infantry Regiment, was in the first single trench. He was a platoon leader of the 1st Company. 1st SS Reconnaissance, but a shell strike to the chest tore him from our ranks. Jupp Hansen, Berg's longtime friend, screamed for help. His cries were choked by the blood. A shrapnel or bullet had punctured his lung, and the wound was fatal. Hansen was dragged to cover and laid on a tent. Jupp recognized me, wanted to speak, but could no longer do so. He died a few hours later. The new day highlighted a bleak landscape. Scorched terrain, craters, uprooted trees, broken equipment and blackened ruins could drive a silent, faint-hearted witness to madness. In front of me was a 1-ton tractor-trailer. It had presented a good illuminated target at night and was now a smoking wreck. A faint puff of smoke was curling across the roadside. The driver sat behind the wheel. His uniform was burned on his body. Only black ash covered his charred chest in places. The blackened skull with empty eye sockets was still staring in the direction of traffic. I wanted to scream, to curse all this madness of war, but I rushed into the next trench and returned fire on a Russian who lay behind a bush not more than 50 meters away on the other side of the road. Looking at the prostrate, scrabbling men on the ground around me, I pictured the bloody fields of Verdun. My comrades and Russian soldiers lay dead in the trenches. They had killed each other. Survivors were throwing the dead out of the shallow trenches. They wanted to live and were seeking shelter. So the day came. Not a single living Russian was to be seen. The battlefield was empty. In front of us were flower-filled meadows and swaying fields of grain. Not a single shot broke the silence of the morning. My huddled comrades crouched, then stood up, first fearfully, then without fear. The first soldier stood up, lit a cigarette, and looked in the direction of the enemy. Everyone looked mesmerized at the standing motorcyclist. Nothing happened. Cheers and words of encouragement passed from trench to trench. Life had taken us in its arms again. It was taking its toll. I shook hands with Hugo Creyas. Throughout the night he had been the backbone of the defense. He blinked nervously. We shook hands, and there was bitterness in his words. We had both lost more of our battle comrades in the last 2 days than in all the previous campaigns combined. The radio said that we would be replaced by the 3rd Battalion, 1st S Infantry Regiment, which should arrive on the ground by noon. Just as we were about to return to the battalion headquarters, SS Untersturmführer Baumhart asked me to scout the thicket 150 meters north of the road. He had recently noticed some movement there. Peter drove towards the thicket and wanted to circle it from a distance. He went around the thicket in a smaller and smaller radius, but I didn't see the enemy. Then Peter came very close. I stood leaning out of the turret hatch. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a Russian officer jumped out. Having made one jump, he was already standing on the slope in front of our car and firing. My whole body jerked back from such an extraordinary leap. I fired my pistol and ducked down. The car stopped. It didn't move. I yelled at Peter. There was a loud bang in the gearbox, and the armoured car jerked and jerked. Peter tried to throw a grenade into the thicket, but it immediately rolled under our armoured vehicle, where it exploded. Peter never repeated such close combat tactics again. Upon arrival in the 1st Company of the 1st SS Infantry Regiment, we came under direct fire from Russian guns, which did not shake the morale of the battalion. The grenadiers under Fritz Witt never showed indecision. This battalion was already a strong, fearless fire department. In a road ditch I met an old comrade with whom I trained in Jüterbog in 1934. Kawasowski, a guy taller than 1.9 meters, was seriously wounded in the leg. A shell fragment shattered his foot. With his folding knife, this native of East Prussia made the final cut and separated the foot from the body. The shift arrived on the scene without delay. Soon SA Hauptsturmführer Hempel was killed. He was a good friend of Gretz's. We buried the dead man to the sound of Russian artillery. The farewell speeches were drowned out by the noise of roaring engines. The highway was open again. Columns of German troops rolled eastward. We moved on Zitomir and fought on the outskirts of Kiev together with the 13th and 14th Panzer Divisions. Our battalion was then replaced by an infantry division reconnaissance battalion and released for other tasks. While Kleist's 1st Tank Group was advancing through Zitomir toward Kiev, units of the 6th Army were attacking Russian forces near Uman, having previously taken Vinnytsia. To the south, the German 17th Army was advancing. Divisions of the IT Motorized Corps, involved in the attack on Kiev, were then replaced by units of the 6th Army and turned to the southeast, to Kirovograd and Kremenchug. About 3 o'clock on July 30, we halted in the southern suburbs of Zybermonovka and covered the right flank of our division, which was under attack. By 5 a.m. we reached Lishinovka, which was defended by a large enemy force. The 2nd Company of the 1st SE Reconnaissance Battalion got bogged down in the swamp on the approach to the village and was pinned to the ground by heavy Russian artillery fire. The 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion was also under heavy fire. Around noon, the Russian troops attempted to break through to the east. Enemy tanks at full speed rushed straight at the motorcyclists and tried to crush our anti-tank weapons. It was impossible for the motorcycle company to withdraw from the battle because of Russian artillery fire. During this brutal battle, SS Untersturmführer SS Beumhardt, who commanded a platoon in the 2nd Company of the 1st SA Reconnaissance Battalion, was killed. The company commander SAS Hauptsturmführer Kraas was wounded. Obersturmführer Speth took temporary command of the company. A shell fragment tore off the lower jaw of one of our youngest comrades, motorcyclist Guzman. At the risk of their own lives, the fighting comrades evacuated him. A sudden attack by several armoured vehicles took the Russian company prisoner. The company had orders to secure passage over the bridge near Lashevoy. On July 31, the battalion was transferred to the operational control of the XXAVI Motorized Corps, which received the task to go to Novoarkhangelsk and complete the encirclement of the Russians in the Uman Cauldron. We reached Novoarkhangelsk exactly at noon without fighting. This large village is spread on the left bank of the small river Sinyuka, which flowed from north to south and was impassable for tanks because of its steep banks. As soon as we reached the first houses of the village, we came under heavy artillery fire from the west. Northwest of the town, I noticed a German battery, several armoured cars and motorcycles moving away to the northeast. These German troops apparently mistook us for Russians. We tried unsuccessfully to contact this German unit with signal flares. However, their fire could not be stopped, and then they withdrew. As we learned later, it was the 16th Reconnaissance Battalion. It had broken away from the enemy in the wrong direction and, consequently, made us work extra hard. We received small arms fire in the village and had to fight our way to the bridge. There we found an abandoned armoured vehicle of the 16th Reconnaissance Battalion. The bridge itself was damaged by mines. In our rear, the 1st Battalion of the 1st SS Infantry Regiment had already reached Novoarkhangelsk and captured the southeastern part of the village. After that, I felt much calmer. We could rely on Fritz Witt. The 1st Battalion of the 1st SS Infantry Regiment and the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion joined up. We always got along well with each other. By 18.0, the village was entirely in our hands. However, apart from my armoured vehicles, there were no other available reserves. When darkness fell, the Russians attacked the battalion's positions, advancing from the northeastern edge of the village with a large force of infantry and 8 tanks. Our 37 MT tank guns opened direct fire. But what is it? It didn't bother the tanks in the slightest. They continued to advance on the motorcyclists. The shells ricocheted off the armour of the Russian tanks. Thank goodness the motorcyclists were among the houses and thus were able to take cover from the tanks. Russian infantry also cut into our positions and squeezed our company. The tanks made a great impression on my soldiers. I hoped it wouldn't turn into a total rout. I thought that maybe our cannon on the bridge would have better luck. I jumped into the assault gun and drove to the bridge, where I met Montag's platoon, which was about to position itself on the near bank of the river. I could not believe my eyes. Motorcycle companies were rushing to the bridge and wanted to get to the opposite bank. A few words were enough to normalize the situation. The companies turned around and pushed back the Russians who had already infiltrated. 4 Russian tanks fell victim to an assault gun and a 47V anti-tank gun. Lines of infantry attack followed at 30A, which was choked under motorized fire. The Russian attacking troops penetrated the village by a stream from the south. However, the bridge, which was guarded by my sappers, was in no danger. At daybreak, the Russian troops that had broken through were partly repulsed and partly captured. All other attacks were also repulsed with heavy losses to the enemy. The ring of encirclement in the cauldron near Umanja's 6th and 12th armies of the Russians compressed more and more strongly. Since August 2, 158.5 mm 6-barrel mortars and batteries of 211 mm mortars had been used against them. From a small elevation, I watched the movement of enemy troops. Several columns of Russians with various weapons hid in the forest 5 kilometers from the positions of the 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion. Obviously, the enemy wanted to attempt another breakthrough to the east as night fell. An alarming artillery fire fell on the entire section of our battalion. More and more columns of Russian troops disappeared into the forest. The slender trees concealed thousands of men. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery sought in the shade of the trees for shelter from observers. Didn't they realize that we could watch all their movements? Russian officers were leading their soldiers and themselves to death. These concentrated forces cannot be allowed to attack. They must be defeated before they do. Otherwise, we will not be able to withstand these masses in the dark. They will crush us and break through like water into the floodgates, and a hole will form in the Uman cauldron. The heavy weapons of the battalion, a unit of 6-barrel mortars, and a battery of 211 mm mortars were engaged to fulfill the combat tasks. To cover the concentrated fire of the forest area, I reserved the right to personally give the order to open fire. By this point, 6-barrel mortars remained an unknown weapon to us. We had no idea of their effectiveness. The hands of the clock were counting down. I waited patiently for the most favourable moment. The flow of Russian soldiers had not yet dried up. The cauldron had overflowed to such an extent that a bulge was already beginning to form from it. The critical moment had arrived. There were signs of the coming night. The outlines of the trees were becoming barely recognizable. Everyone waited tensely for the order to open fire. Fire, and all hell broke loose, set by our sapper platoon and several armoured vehicles. The dam that separated the 2 lakes was the Russians' undoing. Many enemy soldiers, who had no time to resist or even fire a single shot, were captured. The bell tower became my command post. From there I could observe the movements of the enemy and take action in time. More and more Russians appeared from the direction of Shuvanka and disappeared into the swaying wheat field to turn from there for the planned attack on Zaz. I calmly watched the situation unfold, because there was a strip of field at least 400 meters approaching the settlement. In such conditions, any enemy attack would be choked in its own blood. On the horizon, the batteries of the Russian artillery were taking up positions. Mounted messengers galloped across the black earth. There was a mass of targets for our guns in front of us, but we had to conserve ammunition. Our lines of communication were infinitely long, and ammunition was becoming truly precious. We waited for the right moment when each shot would successfully do its bloody work. Small black dots moved toward us across the ripening fields. Every now and then the sun reflected in the shiny metal, glinting brightly against the smoother daylight. The dots grew closer and closer. They no longer resembled ants. In them you could clearly recognize Russian infantrymen. Their fighting order was excellent. They were advancing in a widely dispersed formation. Groups of soldiers were pulling anti-tank guns. The horses stayed behind. I carefully, like a chess player, assessed the situation and prepared those weapons that would be most deadly to the enemy. The Russians were advancing stubbornly but cautiously. Not a single German soldier was visible on the outskirts of Zaziye. The settlement must have looked unoccupied to the Russians. Only the reinforced platoons of the motorcycle companies remained in position, while my other units were awaiting orders to attack north and south of the settlement. I wanted not just to repel the attack, but to destroy the Russian army unit. Such a moment came at Ilio. The Russians were covered with fire from all kinds of weapons, and terrible gaps had formed in their ranks. Our mortars and field guns endeavoured to destroy the enemy's guns with accurate fire. The attacking Russian chains lay down. Then they jumped up and ran forward toward their deaths. Officers and commissars tried to reconstruct the course of the attack, but I saw only individual Russian soldiers running forward. Most remained lying on the ground as if they'd been nailed. The moment had come for the motorcyclists and armoured cars that had been waiting on the flanks. They moved eastward and then turned and chased the Russians toward our positions. By mid-afternoon we had taken 650 prisoners and over 200 had been killed. According to the testimony of the prisoners, the commander of the 962nd Rifle Regiment shot himself after shooting one of his officers. Since this regiment had originally numbered only 900 soldiers, it was virtually annihilated by the losses suffered. During the next few hours we were attacked several more times. In the afternoon a heavy artillery fire was opened on the village. It came from the west, and although we expected an attack from both directions, still this blow took us by surprise. In the blink of an eye, the front line changed, and we took a prearranged position to the west of the village. Unlike the first attack, this one was carried out by motorized forces. Several light amphibious tanks and armored vehicles formed the head unit of the Russian. The Russian artillery hit the position of our battery, where a truck with ammunition exploded. We let the Russians get close again, and they again ran into our concentrated fire. The amphibious tanks were the first casualties. They went up in flames. Black clouds of smoke covered the battlefield, while forward moved our armoured vehicles and tank fighters. They hit the disorganized and partially scattered Russian fighting order. One of our tank fighters stopped and went up in smoke. Red tongues of flame burst from within and engulfed the driver-mechanic before he could be saved. Two other P-21D crewmen were being pulled out of the fiery inferno and had the flames extinguished on them. My ears were ringing from the screams of the badly wounded mechanic driver being burned alive. However, I tore my gaze away from what was happening around the burning tank fighter and pointed my binoculars to the southwest. Clouds of thick dust heralded the arrival of new columns of Russian troops trying to break through to the east. Our armoured cars and tank fighters, like panthers, pounced on these columns and shot up the vehicles, turning them into flaming wreckage. The Russian soldiers tried to scatter in all directions, but only a few managed to escape. Most of the attackers soon had to shave their way down the road leading to captivity. While reporting the situation, I heard the cries of the wounded and the heart-rending screams of our burned comrade. He was lying on a stretcher and begging me to finish him off. Burnt hands lay on his charred body. His hairless head, fallen lips and blackened torso were one continuous wound. The lower part of his body had been protected from the fire by his pants and was therefore not so badly injured. I felt ashamed and could not utter words of comfort. They would have been shameless lies in such a situation. My soldiers stared at me intently. Again and again the young soldier begged for relief from his suffering. The doctor said there was no hope. He couldn't even see where an injection of anesthetic could be given. The doctor could only shrug helplessly. A chilling scream drove me out of the field dressing station. I was unable to say goodbye. I couldn't even put my palm down on his forehead. One last look, and I ran out. With the end of the day came the end of our comrade's life. We held Zasil J, repulsing Russian attacks until August 17, and made a reconnaissance as far south as Snigirevka. That Snigirevka station was cleared of the enemy was reported at 19.0. A shell from an anti-tank gun hit the armoured car of SES Untersturmführer Tide. Data was reported missing. Tide had only hours before learned of the birth of his firstborn son. The 16th Panzer Division managed to seize the city of Nikolaev and drove the Russians back to Kherson. In Nikolaev, the stricken grenadiers discovered a 36,000-ton battleship under construction and not yet off the slipway. On August 18, our battalion was tasked to conduct reconnaissance in the direction of Kherson. This city developed particularly rapidly from the end of the 19th century and into the 1930s. However, on our maps it was labelled as a squalid village. Long before dawn we headed south. A few hours later the shining red face of the sun rose over the Dnieper and warmed our frozen joints. Clouds of dust swirled behind us as we moved quickly forward. A group of motorcyclists, covered by 2 armoured vehicles, followed ahead. The rest of 1st Platoon and my commanding armoured car followed behind them. The vanguard commander was SA-Teamfer Eric, on whom I could rely. After a short time we came across a Russian column that was looking for a ford. We disarmed it and sent it in the direction of Zasilye. Russian trucks were taken as trophies, and they joined our column. The prisoners were glad that the war was over for them and willingly obeyed commands. On either side of our route we found huge vineyards and fields of tomatoes and cucumbers. Soon the whole battalion was greedily devouring tomatoes. Orchards covered the western slopes of the Dnieper Valley, but the fruit was not yet ripe. Our advance southward continued. My soldiers smiled at me as I passed them or passed me radio messages. As men of experience, they certainly had time to notice that at the moment we were not scouting, but fooling around. In reports to the Wehrmacht, such actions were labelled as a surprise attack. But this surprise attack was far from being the brainchild of an impulse or the idea of some reckless commander. No. A surprise attack was in most cases an operation planned in advance by a responsible commander. Such a commander knew the situation and was eager to achieve great success through cold-blooded planning, fearlessness and courage, and quick action. The prerequisite for this kind of fighting was, in addition to military ability, outstanding human qualities. The commander must enjoy the absolute trust of the soldiers and be, in the true sense of the word, the combat leader of his unit or unit. The order to launch a surprise strike cannot be given from above. The General Staff does not have the ability to issue commands on the actual battlefield based on intuitive conclusions. The prerogative to deliver a surprise strike rests solely and entirely with the combat commander himself. It is not uncommon for a lightning-quick operation to seem reckless on the part of a commander who is fortunate, but reality has another side. Such a commander literally puts himself in the enemy's shoes. He knows the failures and setbacks the enemy suffers. He is familiar with the physical and mental strain the enemy is under. He knows his strengths and weaknesses. He does not rely on intelligence reports from higher authorities. They give only the general situation and the balance of forces in the current operation, and not an iota more. The combat commander develops his own assessment of the situation. From thousands of scraps of information he has an idea of the enemy. He can read the operational situation on the ground like a book. He awakens deeply hidden instincts of the hunter and warrior. Such a commander sees and feels the enemy. The faces of prisoners reveal to him more than the pages of interrogation. A combat commander is not only a superior officer, but a man who leads by example. His will is the will of his soldiers. He draws his strength from his grenadiers who believe in him and will follow him even into hell. On the horizon we could already distinguish the outlines of Kherson. Grain elevators towered over the Dnieper. The western part of the city was full of tall chimneys of factories. In front of us were shady, beckoning trees. The scorching sun burned us. We longed for water and shade in the city. A few kilometers from Kherson, I stood for a long time on an armored vehicle and examined the city spread out before my eyes. On the Dnieper, which flowed here from east to west, there was a lively movement of ships, back and forth snivelling gunboats. Large steam ferries lazily pulled to the far shore, relieved there of their cargo and returned to Kherson. The city seemed to be within easy reach. It tempted, it beckoned to me and seemed to laugh at my indecision. The company officers looked at me expectantly. I could see from the artilleryman's face that he had already determined the positions from which to provide fire support for the battalion's advance. At this time, my soldiers were again sitting in the tomato fields and eating the marvellous fruit with pleasure. I envied their carefree attitude. I lit another cigarette, blowing smoke into the trembling air. I felt absolutely confident, and I had no misgivings that the huge city might swallow us up. My decision was firm. The city was to fall under a sudden attack. The Russians expected an attack from the northwest of Nikolaev. In this direction they prepared their defences. That's where the Lebstand division was, ready to attack. We drove to the city on a country road along the Dnieper, and with a move crushed a company of Red Army soldiers, erecting a barrier in the outskirts of the city. From the surprise, the Red Army soldiers forgot to exchange their shovels for weapons. But here in front of us grew modern multi-story buildings. The enemy machine gun whipped the ground around. The battle for Kherson began. As Sturmführer, Eric touched his steel helmet with his index finger, shouted "Go" to the head squad and ran at full speed across the wide square. It disappeared behind the wide street leading to the center of Kherson. The platoon followed its leader. The armored vehicles shot their 20 mm guns into the space in front of the houses. The muffled explosions of hand grenades indicated that close combat was underway. I followed the front platoon and suddenly found myself again at the Dnieper. The road twisted like a snake, passing through the old neighborhood of fortresses. From the southeast bank of the river, Russian artillery began an intense bombardment of the road. The Soviet sailors fought with the fury of wildcats. The fire forced us to abandon our vehicles and continue the fight on foot. A row of houses sheltered us from view from the east bank of the river. Clinging tightly to the walls, we fought for every house on both sides of the street. Eric fought like a lion. This blonde warrior from Schleswig-Holstein roared, leaping from aisle to aisle, setting the pace for the attack. Machine gun fire shot sparks off the sidewalk. The attack had stopped. Machine gun fire was an almost insurmountable obstacle for the lead units. But for Eric, there was no stopping. He knew we had to reach the port to prevent the Soviets from organizing a defense. Eric lay a few paces away, holding the automatic rifle firmly in his strong hands, his legs tucked up against his body. Tucking his helmet back, he commanded First Platoon advancing across the road. "Stand by. Let's go." I saw the young soldiers jump up, rush across the street, and fall to the sidewalk as if they'd been hit by a line. Their concerted dash had fooled the enemy machine gunner. Soon he was firing no more. We reached a small square. The sailors had taken up position among the ornamental bushes and were trying to halt our advance. Making a dash, I suddenly saw Eric fall to the sidewalk. The automatic rifle fell to the pavement with a metallic clang. Eric bent down, his hands searching for something to hold on to. He scrabbled at the ground with his hands. The grenadiers dragged their platoon leader to the wall of the house and shouted for medics. The bullet cracked Eric's skull. I wanted to say a few words and shake his hand, but he heard nothing more. It was his last battle. 2 more days later, after dictating a letter to his wife, he closed his eyes forever. In Eric, the company had lost one of its best non-commissioned officers, and I had lost one of my most loyal soldiers. The fighting was getting fiercer. Russian guns were pounding the street. Fuel depots were burning. High up in the air poured thick smoke. From the explosions, everything went up. Wishing to find shelter in the shelled street, I piled all my body weight on some gates, but they were on the bolt. Bullets hit the sidewalk and ricocheted with a screech. I thought the game was over and ran down the street, fired upon by the sailors. It seemed to me that cover would be a kiosk, but the bullets split its thin wooden walls, and the machine gun bursts blew the kiosk to pieces. A chainsaw couldn't have done it any better. Pressed tightly to the ground, I waited for the firefight between the Soviet soldiers and the soldiers of my first platoon to end. Again, I was between two positions. After a few minutes, the situation diffused and the assault on the port continued. The Soviet troops withdrew to the harbour area. Two large ferries on the quay were picking up fleeing fighters. We were getting closer and closer. Mortar shells whistling down were hindering our rapid advance to the port, but we were unstoppable. Street after street, house after house fell into our hands. Padded with nails with wide caps, our boots clattered on the sidewalk of this strategically important city on the Dnieper. Our machine guns pounded the pier. They were not heavy weapons, but the effect of their firing was murderous. Paying no attention to the men still running toward them, the ships cast off and headed toward the southeastern shore. As the ferries pulled heavily and clumsily away from the wharf, men clung to the sides of the vessels, hanging like bunches of grapes. Barrels of oil and fuel flew into the air, and men engulfed in flames leapt to their deaths, disappearing in the torrent of the strong current of the river. Some Russians came out of this hell in tears, some sought escape by throwing themselves into the Dnieper. A tractor with an 88M anti-aircraft gun passed through the thick smoke from the burning barrels and took up a convenient firing position. Barely had the gun been brought into the firing position when the first shell burst from the barrel and exploded in the bow of one of the large ferries. The gun stood under a hail of fire in full view of the Russian gunners. Ammunition, vehicles, and fuel left behind were burning and exploding, the wreckage whistling around the cannon, which stood alone on the wharf. The abandoned horses, not knowing where to go and leaping at random, fell, choking, into the brownish swift stream. A large barge drifted unguided by anyone toward the shore and ran aground. The Russian soldiers tried to swim to the saving shore. Only a few succeeded in escaping. Most of them were swept out to sea by the current. I heard Obersturmführer Norman shouting as he guided the second gun of his platoon into firing position. He yelled in the heat of battle and rushed to the first gun. My God! At that moment I saw the danger, but the grenadiers at the gun evidently did not notice it, absorbed in the firefight. The gun rolled slowly down the wharf and plunged into the Dnieper. Fortunately, all the soldiers survived, but our cannon was lost. It was a great loss. The firing in the harbour subsided. Only a few shells with a howl flew over us and exploded somewhere in the city. The connection with the Division Leibstandarte, attacking from the northwest, occurred at 16.0. The battle for Kherson was over. With the elimination of the fires in the port, work began to restore and maintain order in the city. It was cleared of debris, citizens came out of their hiding places, and the first children began to socialize with the German soldiers. On August 22, our battalion was replaced by Hitzfeld's regiment. The 73rd Infantry Division reached the Dnieper River and prepared to cross it north of Kherson. From the Dnieper to the Don, continuous fighting until the very last moment placed inordinate demands on our battalion and cost it dearly. Heavy losses spoke eloquently about the necessity of resting men and repairing equipment. Officers and soldiers did everything in their power to fulfill their assigned tasks. The battalion had long since fed itself and required a thorough medical examination. Finally, we were in dire need of replenishment, both in personnel and combat equipment. The Leibstandarte division had been withdrawn from the front line and had to be re-equipped and resupplied within a week. We were glad for this break and enjoyed the few remaining sunny days of rest as a gift from God. All our desires were being satisfied. We went to bed at the end of the day and basked in relative peace, but soon there was concern. It soon became clear to us that repair was out of the question. The repair and recovery services did attempt to repair weapons and military equipment, but their efforts were a drop in the ocean. There was a shortage of spare parts. The battalion partially adopted trophy equipment. Replenishment of personnel also had to wait for a long time. Day flew by day, and the eagerly awaited replenishment from Germany was still not there. The result of this re-equipment was that serious problems had to be raised before senior commanders. In the initial period of the war, we had a concrete and achievable goal before us. We were fully staffed when we started moving towards this goal and fought in absolute confidence in its achievability. But now, after so much fighting and reaching this water frontier, our battalion was no longer a full-fledged fighting group. We could field only a fraction of our former strength. It didn't take much effort to calculate how long it would be until our proud battalion would cease to exist as a fighting unit. What happens when, with this shabby battalion, we force the Dnieper and move eastward? What are our objectives? Will we be able to reach them before winter comes? We've talked about the Don, the Volga, and the Caucasus. The endless length of the Russian expanse overwhelmed us. We began to think in Russian. Nothing. I again led my vanguard battalion to the Dnieper on September 8 and crossed the river on September 9 at 16:30. The bridgehead on the left bank of the river was taken by the 73rd Infantry Division under General Bieler. We slowly crossed on a rickety pontoon bridge over a width of muddy waters. Self-propelled guns and tanks were ferried separately on ferries. The commander of the crossing area handed me orders from the Live Army Corps, and at the same time informed me that my battalion was to be attached to the 73rd Infantry Division upon completion of the river crossing. The division commander was waiting for me southeast of Berislav. Accompanied by 2 messengers on motorcycles, I drove slowly to the command post. Along the road everywhere were visible fresh graves of fallen German and Russian soldiers. In view of the expected night operation, I allowed my soldiers to go to the river to bathe. I found the headquarters of the 73rd Infantry Division in an orchard. I was tasked to break through from the bridgehead to the south, advancing on the settlement of Novaya Mayaka, targeting Kopani, and take a circular defense for the night. Colonel Hitzfeld's regiment was to be our neighbor on the left. Immediately after the general's first words, I signaled one of my motorcycle messengers to relay to the battalion the command to be ready to move out. He rushed back to the battalion to begin preparing for the march there. In the course of receiving the order, I relayed through another messenger the order to the battalion to start moving. He chased his motorcycle and relayed this order. A few minutes later, I saw that my company commanders were already waiting for me. They were chatting with Major Stifter. After a detailed briefing, General Bieler offered me a cup of coffee and asked, "When can you move on the road?" He followed my gaze in amazement, and I pointed to the waiting company commanders, the approaching dust cloud, and replied, "Mr. General, the battalion is on its way." I shall never forget his dumbfounded look. The failed, broken, and dusty road slowed our pace. Soon we had left behind the last forward posts of the 73rd Infantry Division and were moving in the dark. Bremer was ahead of us, moving slowly and cautiously forward. We rolled into the night, engines rumbling. We were enveloped in pitch blackness. At 21.0, 4 kilometers north of Novaya Mayaka, we came into contact with the enemy. The Russian combat guard we took by surprise and captured without a fight. The Soviet soldiers gave the impression of completely exhausted people and readily gave us the information we needed. According to their testimony, Novaya Mayachka was held by a considerable force. After 8 days of rest, I felt somewhat insecure. I had no clear view of the enemy. We were in a situation in which we felt like strangers, and for that reason we were advancing uncertainly. I was looking forward to the coming of a new day. The bright morning light would give us the security we needed. A dense porcupine defense formation made up our fortress. I sat in the radio communication vehicle and talked to a captured Red Army commander about what kind of action his superiors might take. The Perekop and the Tatar moat kept slipping into the conversation again and again. The prisoner was convinced that the Tatar moat was prepared for defense. The night was quiet. Not a single shot rang out. This tranquility was ghostly. A couple of shots would reveal where the enemy was. In the meantime, we felt as if we were completely surrounded by Soviet troops. Dew had descended on the dry surface of the leaves as the first faint rays of sunlight heralded the coming of a new day. I was tense and nervous as I tried to get a glimpse of Novaya Mayoshka through the barely glimmering dawn. Seeing the outline of the town slowly emerged from the surrounding haze. The motorcyclists sat on their motorcycles and awaited the order to attack. At 4-0 the end of peace and quiet came. Hitzfeld's regiment attacked New Beacon from the north. The noise of battle filled the air and removed fatigue like a hand. The infantrymen of the 73rd Infantry Division moved forward in the still faint morning light. All the Russian artillery shells sweeping their way could not stop the men who were relentlessly making their way toward the city. In the fading morning twilight, we were able to view the enemy's fortification system. It was well adapted to the terrain west of the city and built to perfection, as the Russians always are. They were masters at constructing field defensive positions. The attacking 73rd Infantry Division was occupying more and more terrain, and it was time to attack the fortification system itself. Our battalion prepared for the attack behind a wide hedge of woodland. The Soviets had not yet noticed us, and their artillery was doing its best to suppress the 73rd Infantry Division's attack. We, on the other hand, had 2 kilometers to cover to reach the enemy positions, and the terrain was devoid of any cover. There was no wooded area visible anywhere except for our forest belt. In front of us lay the steppe of northern Tavria, smooth as a board with hard, cracked soil, and with steppe grass growing somewhere. I, together with the commander of the 1st Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion, watched the movement in the Russian defensive positions and realized that with a swift attack of my battalion, the enemy would be completely defeated. Moreover, our attack would also contribute to the division's advance. I pondered which attacking unit would cover the expanse of no man's land without casualties at the highest possible speed. The steppe spaces made me think of the swift cavalry attacks of times gone by. The devil himself must have been whispering to me at that moment, what if a swift attack by my motorcyclist succeeds? I didn't dare to voice my thoughts. I still thought such an attack was mad, and yet, while common sense and intuition fought among themselves for the final decision, mentally I could already see my motorcyclists riding like devils on roaring BMWs across the steppe and cutting into the enemy positions. My soldiers looked at me in silence, and I looked over the steppe again and again, estimating the distance. I lowered the binoculars and looked into Bremer's eyes with a questioning look. How would he react, assessing the situation, if I ordered his motorcyclists to attack? Would he expect something unusual to be expected any time soon? His gaze was open and his face expressed no surprise when I outlined my intention to attack the enemy with motorcycles and armoured vehicles. My greyhounds received the order with icy calm, and as a matter of course. Artillery and other heavy weapons took their intended positions. The motorcyclists deployed along a wide front, for now protected by a forest belt. The armoured cars moved forward at predetermined intervals, so as to be able to open barrage fire and impede. Gripped by feverish excitement, I climbed into my armoured car and threw my arm vertically upward. There was no turning back. The lot was cast, uncertainty evaporated. Our armoured car slowly rolled out from behind cover. We were in sight of the Russians. The first enemy shells were about to rain down on us. I pulled up, looked out of the armoured car, and looked ahead. We were moving between 2 motorcycle companies. The motorcyclists jumped into their vehicles with the agility of monkeys. After 100 meters, I could no longer make out anything. In front of us, shadows were running and falling. The attack turned into a race. Would it be a race to the death? Russian shells were howling over us and exploding where we had been only seconds before. Artillery fire drove us even more. Our speed increased. We had to outsmart the Russian fire control system and burst into the Soviet positions like fiends. Captivated by the excitement of speed and intoxicated by the roar of the engines, which penetrated us to the marrow of our bones, we looked out for the enemy, squinting our eyes. Our goal was where artillery was performing its deadly task, where the blood of Russian soldiers was already sprinkling the ground. The picture of destruction spurred us on. We were rushing toward death as if possessed. Suddenly the first Russians appeared. We were stared at by faces contorted with horror. They dropped their weapons and ran west. We were advancing through the defense system, past the trenches, past the crumpled bodies of dead and mortally wounded soldiers. Many Soviet soldiers fled in disarray to the west, where they were surrounded. However, the Russian artillery was still somewhere in firing position. There was no way we could interrupt our frantic pursuit. The enemy trucks tried to escape, but were set on fire by the fire of the 20 automatic guns of our armoured vehicles. We drove past the abandoned guns and rushed on, passing Novaya Mayotka and heading in the direction of Staraya Mayotka. The tension gradually subsided. No more signs of life could be seen around us. The steppe lay before us as if extinct. On the other hand, the area behind us resembled an anthill. Both our own and strangers were equally helping the wounded. An exchange of handshakes with Colonel Hitzfeld, a brief orientation on the situation with the 73rd Infantry Division commanders, and the advance southward continued. 534, mostly wounded, Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner during the attack. As for our personnel losses, 2 soldiers were killed in action. A sergeant and 2 other privates died of wounds. The attack was a complete success, but nevertheless never again did I order such a motorcycle attack.